Hello, everyone. I know many of you are listening while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. The summer of 2017 in Champaign, Illinois was warm and wide and full of the particular quiet that settles over a university town when the academic year ends and the undergraduates go home. The streets around the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign breathed a little easier in those months. The pace slowed the campus, which during the school year hums with the compressed energy of tens of thousands of young people moving through their days with urgency and purpose, became something softer in the summer. Something almost pastoral. The old brick buildings sat in the heat. The trees threw long shadows across the wide walkways. The surrounding the city stood tall and green and alive, and the sky above all of it was the kind of deep, uncomplicated blue that makes the Midwest feel, in summer, like a place where nothing bad could happen. It looked like safety. It looked like exactly the kind of place a young woman from the other side of the world could come to build something real, something lasting, something that would matter. Her name was Yinjing Zhang. She was 26 years old. She had traveled from Fujian province in southeastern China to pursue a doctoral degree in atmospheric sciences at one of the most respected research universities in the United States. She had earned her place there. She had worked for it with the particular discipline of a person who does not take opportunity for granted, who understands that the doors that open to you are doors you have to push through completely, fully without hesitation. She was exactly that kind of person. And on the afternoon of July 1st, 2017, she stepped into a stranger's car on a Champaign street. She was never seen alive again. Yinjing Zhang was born in 1990 in Nanping, a city tucked into the forested mountains of Fujian province in southeastern China. Nanping is not a city that appears on the maps that most people in the Western world carry in their heads. It is not Shanghai or Beijing or Guangzhou. Not one of the great gleaming metropolises that China presents to the outside world as evidence of its transformation. It is something quieter than that. A city surrounded by green mountains and river valleys, a place with a long history and a slower pace, a place where the rhythms of family and community still organize life in ways that larger, faster cities have largely left behind. Yinjing grew up in that environment, shaped by it in the way that people are shaped by the particular texture of the place and the family that contains their childhood. Her father, Rongo Zhang, was a man of quiet strength, the kind of father who expressed love not through grand gestures but through steady, reliable presence. Her mother, Lai Fengyi, was warm and attentive, the kind of mother who notices everything. She had a younger brother. She had a family that was close and caring and that believed, with the particular conviction of Chinese families of their generation, that education was the most powerful thing a parent could give a child. Yinjing absorbed that belief completely. And she was from early in her schooling, a genuinely gifted student. Not the performative kind, not the kind who chases grades for the sake of external validation, but the kind who is actually curious. The kind who reads past what is required. The kind who asks questions that go beyond the edges of the curriculum, because the questions genuinely interest her. Her teachers recognized it. Her parents encouraged it. And the result was a young woman who moved through her academic life with a sense of direction that felt natural rather than forced, as though she were following something that was already inside her, rather than building toward something imposed from outside. She studied environmental science as an undergraduate. She developed a specific and genuine interest in atmospheric science, the study of the systems that govern the air, the weather, the climate. These are not small subjects. The atmosphere is one of the most complex dynamic systems on Earth, and the people who spend their lives trying to understand it are doing work that matters in ways that extend far beyond the laboratory. Climate science, air quality, weather modeling, these are fields with direct consequences for human life on a global scale. Yinjing understood that. It was part of what drew her in. She completed a master's degree in China, and then she looked outward. She looked at the research institutions across the world, where the best atmospheric science was being done. where the most interesting questions were being asked, where the opportunity to contribute something real was most available to a young scholar who was willing to work for it, and she applied to doctoral programs in the United States. The University of Illinois accepted her. She came. She arrived in Champaign in 2016. She began the slow, patient work of building a life in a new place. This is something that international graduate students do quietly and persistently and largely invisibly to the people around them. They learn the transit routes and the grocery stores and the rhythms of a campus that was built for people who already know how everything works. They navigate bureaucracies in a second language. They manage homesickness with the particular discipline of people who have chosen to be far from home and who understand that the choice was worth making, even on the days when it does not feel that way. Yingying navigated all of it. She found her apartment. She found the lab and the library and the coffee places and the walking routes that became hers. She made friends, other graduate students, other international students, people who were also in the process of making a foreign campus feel like home. She worked hard in her program, the way her advisors expected her to and the way she expected of herself. She was, by every account, exactly the kind of doctoral student that a research university wants. Focused and rigorous and genuinely invested in the work. But she was more than a student. She had a full interior life that existed alongside the academic one, and that was, to the people who knew her well, the more vivid and memorable thing about her. She was warm in a way that was not performed. She was funny in a quiet way, the kind of funny that surfaces unexpectedly and is all the more effective for it. She was a photographer. She had a genuine eye, a real instinct for the image, and she documented her time in Champaign with the attentiveness of someone who wants to remember what a place looked like before she has to leave it. She had Zheng Shu, her boyfriend, also a graduate student at the university, was by all accounts a devoted and loving partner. They had grown close through the shared intensity of graduate school life, the kind of closeness that forms between people who are going through something demanding together, who see each other at their most exhausted and most exhilarated, who know each other in the specific way that only shared difficulty allows. He loved her clearly and openly. She loved him back. She was in the spring and early summer of 2017, thinking about the future, about where the research would take her, about what came after the doctorate. She was 26, which is exactly the age at which the long preparation years of academic life begin to yield to the actual life you have been preparing for. When the horizon starts to clarify, when the things you have been working toward start to become real and specific rather than abstract and distant. She was ready for that horizon. She was moving toward it steadily, one day at a time. She was not moving toward what actually came. The 1st of July fell on a Saturday that year, and Yingying had a practical errand to run. She had an appointment to sign a lease for a new apartment, a concrete, mundane, entirely ordinary task of adult life in a university town. She had the address, she knew the time. She left her current apartment and she made her way to the bus stop, and she boarded the MTD bus that would take her toward her destination. She missed her stop. It is such a small thing. The smallest possible human error. The kind of thing that happens every day to millions of people who are riding public transit in cities that are not yet fully familiar to them, who are tired or distracted or simply not watching closely enough for the right landmark. You miss your stop. The bus carries you a little further than you intended. You get off at the next stop and you look around, and you figure out where you are, and you adjust your route, and you keep going. Under almost any circumstances that this has ever happened to anyone in the history of public transit, it amounts to nothing, a slight inconvenience, a few extra minutes. Yingying got off the bus several blocks from where she needed to be. She was on a street she did not know perfectly. She was running a little late. She looked around to get her bearings. At the curb, a black Saturn Astra was idling. The man inside was 28 years old. His name was Brent Christensen. He was a doctoral student in physics at the same university where Yingying was pursuing her degree. He looked, from the outside, like nothing more the young man sitting in a car on a summer afternoon. He was not nothing more than that, but Yingying Zhang had no way of knowing that. She had no way of seeing what was behind the ordinary seeming face, behind the unremarkable exterior, behind the graduate student veneer that Brent Christensen wore with such complete facility that the people who worked alongside him every day had no idea it was a veneer at all. She got into the car. The alarm was raised that evening. Jung Shu noticed the silence first, the way a person who loves someone notices the quality of their absence before they can fully articulate what it means. The messages going unanswered, the evening stretching out without word from her, the feeling physical and immediate and not yet rational that something was wrong. He tried to reach her. He contacted people. He traced what he knew of her plans. And with each hour that passed without explanation, the concern deepened into something heavier and harder to hold. By the time investigators were notified, by the time the missing persons report had been filed, and the machinery of an investigation had begun to turn, the evening of July 1st had become the night of July 1st, and there was still no sign of Yinjing Zhang. The university was notified. The community began to respond. An investigator started pulling surveillance footage from the area where she had last been seen, from the bus route, from the intersection where she had gotten off, from the cameras mounted on nearby buildings and businesses. What they found on that footage was the last image of Yinjing Zhang any camera would ever capture. She was standing on a corner. She was looking around, getting her bearings. And then a black Saturn Astra pulled up beside her, and she got in, and the car drove away, and she was gone. The footage gave investigators something critical: the car. A black Saturn Astra visible clearly enough to begin the process of identification. And that process, conducted with the patient and methodical intensity of investigators who understood exactly what was at stake, led within days to a name: Brent Christensen. When investigators turned their attention to Brent Christensen, they found a man whose surface presented nothing alarming. He had grown up in Champaign. He was a doctoral student in physics, an academically demanding field that selects for intelligence and discipline, and the capacity to work through problems that do not yield easily. He had an apartment. He had a girlfriend. He showed up to his department. He was, in the social landscape of the University of Illinois physics program, an unremarkable presence, not remarkable for brilliance, not remarkable for difficulty, not remarkable for anything. Just there, just another graduate student moving through the days. But investigators did not stop at the surface. They looked at his digital life, and what they found there. In the online spaces where Brent Christensen had been active, in the forums and the postings, and the written record he had left in places he believed were safe from scrutiny, was something that made the direction of the investigation completely clear. He had been posting on a website frequented by people with violent predatory fantasies about women. He had been posting there with a specificity and a level of detail that went far beyond fantasy. He had written about wanting to abduct a woman. He had written about methods. He had written about what he intended to do. And the timeline of those postings, cross-referenced with the date of Yinjing Zhang's disappearance, told a story that had only one possible reading. This had been planned. Brent Christensen had not stumbled into anything. He had not acted impulsively, had not made a decision in a moment of uncontrolled darkness that he could not have predicted or prevented. He had thought about this. He had written about it. He had prepared for it. And on the afternoon of July 1st, 2017, he had driven slowly through the streets of Champaign looking for a woman who was alone and vulnerable and trying to get somewhere. And he had found Yinjing Zhang on a corner, disoriented and late and looking for a way to her appointment. And he had offered her a ride. Investigators began monitoring Christensen closely in the days after identifying him. This is standard procedure. When you have a person of interest in a case this serious, you do not move immediately. You watch, you listen. You build the strongest possible picture before you make your move, because the legal case that follows needs to be built on evidence that will hold. They watched him. They listened. And then something happened that gave them everything they needed. The university community organized vigils for Yinjing Zhang, candlelit gatherings, moments of collective grief and solidarity, events where people who were mourning her disappearance came together, because the alternative, doing nothing, sitting alone with the fear and the sorrow, was not something the community could tolerate. Brent Christensen attended one of these vigils. He stood among the mourners. He stood among the candles. He stood in the middle of a gathering of people who were grieving the woman he had taken, and he had a conversation with his girlfriend, Michelle Le. Investigators were listening to that conversation, and what Brent Christensen said at that vigil, surrounded by people who loved Ying Zhang and prayed for her return, was not the statement of a man who did not know what had happened to her. He told Michelle Le that he had abducted Ying Zhang. He told her he had taken her to his apartment. He told her that Ying was dead, and he told her that she would never be found. The recording captured every word. Federal agents arrested Brent Christensen on June 30, 2017, less than 4 weeks after Ying Zhang had disappeared. The charge was kidnapping, because despite what he had said to Michelle Le, despite what the evidence strongly suggested, there was as yet no body, no physical remains. And without that, the charge that could be formally brought in that moment was kidnapping. He was in custody. That was real. That was something. But Ying Zhang was still missing, and her family, her father and mother who had crossed the Pacific Ocean to be in Champaign, because being far away was unbearable, were still without the answer that no parent should ever have to seek. They stood in front of cameras. They said her name. They asked anyone with any information to come forward. They held on to each other, and they endured day after day, in the particular way that people endure things that should not be survivable. The federal detention facility where Brent Christensen was being held in the summer of 2017 was a quiet place compared to what was happening outside its walls. Outside, the University of Illinois campus was processing something it had no framework for. Universities are built around the idea of safety, not just physical safety, though that too, but the deeper safety of intellectual community, of shared purpose, of the particular covenant between an institution and the people who come to it from across the world, trusting that it will hold them. That covenant had been broken in the most violent and irreversible way possible, and the campus was trying to understand what that meant while simultaneously trying to keep functioning, keep teaching, keep moving through the rhythms of summer session and research and the ordinary business of academic life. It was not easy. The Chinese student community at Illinois was, in those weeks, carrying a weight that was both collective and deeply personal. Many of the students who had come from China to study at this university under circumstances similar to Ying's had left families behind, had navigated the strangeness of a foreign campus, had built lives in a country whose language and customs were not theirs by birth. They understood, in a way that perhaps only they fully could, what it meant to be in a place like Champaign, trying to build something, and to have that security shattered by the disappearance of someone who had been doing exactly what they were doing. The fear was real and specific and personal. It was not abstract. Vigils continued. Searches continued. The community showed up in the way that communities can show up when something terrible has happened to one, imperfectly, incompletely, but with genuine care. Volunteers organized. Faculty made public statements. The university administration, navigating the complex territory between institutional obligation and genuine human response, committed resources to the search and to the support of Yinjing's family. And through all of it, investigators were building their case. The case against Brent Christensen was, from the beginning, one that rested on multiple categories of evidence that would need to work together to establish not just that he had taken Ying Zhang, but what had happened after he took her. The kidnapping charge had been filed, but investigators and federal prosecutors understood that what they were actually dealing with was a murder without, at that point, a body. And prosecuting a murder without a body is one of the most challenging things that the legal system is ever asked to do. It happens. It has been done. Juries have convicted defendants of murder in cases where no remains were ever found, where the physical evidence of death was absent, but the circumstantial case was so overwhelming that no other conclusion was rationally available. But it requires the construction of a case that is essentially airtight in every other respect, a case where every available piece of evidence, every witness, every digital record, every behavioral indicator points in the same direction with such force and clarity that reasonable doubt becomes genuinely impossible to sustain. Federal prosecutors in the Central District of Illinois were committed to building that case, and the evidence they had to work with was, in many respects, extraordinary. Start with the digital record. Because the digital record in the Christensen case is one of the most extensive and damning that investigators in a case like this have ever encountered, and it begins not with the crime itself but with the period leading up to it, with the months and weeks before July 1, 2017, during which Brent Christensen had been constructing and writing, in the online spaces he believed were private, a detailed and explicit account of exactly what he intended to do. The website what he had been posting was a darknet forum, a space that exists in the parts of the internet designed for anonymity, where the normal safeguards of monitored social media platforms do not apply, and where people who harbor violent and predatory desires find each other and validate with each other the things they cannot share anywhere else. The existence of these spaces is one of the more disturbing features of the contemporary internet, and investigators who work on crimes like this are deeply familiar with them. Christensen had been a regular participant in one of these forums, and the content of what he had posted there was not vague or ambiguous, or in any way open to innocent interpretation. He had written explicitly about his desire to abduct a woman. He had written about the specific methods he was considering. He had written about what he intended to do with a woman once he had her. He had written with the clinical detachment of a person who had been thinking about this for a long time, not the agitated, emotional language of someone in crisis, but the measured, considered language of someone who had been working through a plan. The timeline of those postings was critical. They established that what happened on July 1, 2017, was not spontaneous. There was no version of events in which Brent Christensen had simply had a terrible moment, a catastrophic failure of judgment, an impulsive act that he could not have predicted. The record on that darknet forum showed a person who had been moving deliberately toward this for months. That record would become central to the prosecution's case. It would be presented in court as evidence not just of premeditation but of character, of the kind of person Brent Christensen was beneath the unremarkable doctoral student exterior that he had maintained so successfully that virtually no one in his daily life had any idea what was building inside him. Then there was the recording, the conversation that Brent Christensen had with Michelle Lee at the vigil, the conversation that investigators had captured on recording equipment placed in advance, was, in terms of its evidentiary value, almost without parallel. Here was the defendant in his own voice, in his own words, telling another person what he had done, not under interrogation, not in response to police pressure, voluntarily, of his own initiative, standing at a vigil for the woman he had killed, speaking her name to his girlfriend, as though what he was describing were something he could simply tell someone and have it contained. The recording documented him saying that he had abducted Yinjing Zhang. It documented him saying that he had taken her to his apartment. It documented him making statements about what had happened there, statements that made clear she was dead, and it documented him saying that she would never be found. For investigators and prosecutors, this was not merely a piece of evidence. It was the spine of the case. It established, in the most direct and unambiguous possible way, that Brent Christensen knew what had happened to Yinjing Zhang, because he was the person who had made it happen. But there was a legal complication that the prosecution would need to navigate carefully. Michelle Liu was not just a witness. She was Christensen's girlfriend. And the circumstances under which the recording had been made, the fact that she had not known she was being recorded, the fact that the conversation had occurred in a private setting, raised questions about admissibility that the defense would certainly challenge. The legal architecture around recorded conversations is complex, and both sides understood that the handling of this evidence would be one of the defining battles of the case. There was also the question of Michelle Lee herself. She was, by virtue of her relationship with Christensen, and by virtue of what she had heard at that vigil, in an extraordinarily difficult position. She had heard her boyfriend tell her that he had killed someone. She was now a material witness in a federal murder case. Whatever she had felt for Brent Christensen before that conversation, whatever the relationship had been between them, it was now something entirely different. It was a tangle of shock and fear, and the particular horror of discovering that the person you have been living alongside and trusting is not who you thought they were. She cooperated with investigators. Her cooperation would prove significant. But even with the digital record and the recording, prosecutors needed more. They needed to establish what had happened inside Brent Christensen's apartment on the afternoon of July 1, 2017. And to do that, they needed to look at the physical evidence. Investigators executed a search of Christensen's apartment. What they found there, and what forensic examination of what they found there would reveal, was processed carefully and methodically by the kind of forensic specialists who spend their careers doing this work, and who understand that in a case without a body, every piece of physical evidence carries a weight that it would not necessarily carry in other circumstances. The forensic evidence found in the apartment was consistent with violence having occurred there, consistent with the kind of violence that the recording had suggested. It was not evidence that provided a complete and cinematic reconstruction of exactly what had happened. That is not how forensic evidence works, and it would be dishonest to suggest otherwise. But it was evidence that pointed, firmly and clearly, in a direction that corroborated everything else investigators had found. There was also the question of Christensen's behavior in the period after the disappearance. Investigators paid close attention to this, to how he had conducted himself in the days and weeks between July 1st and his arrest. How had he behaved around his colleagues? What had he said to people who asked about the missing student? Had he shown signs of distress, of guilt, of the kind of behavioral disruption that frequently surfaces in people who have committed violent acts and are living in the aftermath? The picture that emerged was in its own way deeply disturbing. Christensen had, by most accounts, continued to function with a remarkable degree of normalcy in the days after Yingying Zhang's disappearance. He had shown up, he had engaged with people. He had not visibly fallen apart. There was no obvious external manifestation of what he had done, except for the vigil, the decision to attend a vigil for the woman he had killed, and then to speak about what he had done at that vigil to his girlfriend while surrounded by people who were genuinely grieving, was either a catastrophic failure of judgment or something stranger and more disturbing than that. It was the behavior of a person who existed in a different relationship to consequence than the people around him. A person who had done something monstrous and who was, at some level, engaging with the aftermath of it in ways that defied ordinary psychological logic. Investigators noted it. Prosecutors noted it, and it would contribute in due course to the picture of Brent Christensen that the trial would present to the jury. While the legal case was being assembled, while the evidence was being gathered and organized, and prepared for the courtroom that everyone understood was coming, Yingying Zhang's family was living inside a particular kind of suspended grief that has very few parallels in human experience. Rongga Zhang and Life In Yu were in Champagne. They had come from China, crossing the ocean to be in the city where their daughter had last been seen, because to remain in Nanping while this was happening was something they simply could not do. They needed to be here. They needed to be close to the place where she had been, close to the people who were searching for her, close to whatever remained of her in this city that had been her home for the last year of her life. They stayed in Champagne through the summer, through the arrest, through the preliminary legal proceedings, through the slow, grinding process of a federal investigation moving toward a trial that was still months away. They stayed because leaving felt like abandonment, even though there was nothing their physical presence could change. They spoke to the media. Rongga Zhang, a man who by all accounts was not by nature a public person, stood in front of cameras and microphones, and said his daughter's name and asked for help and expressed, in the measured and dignified way of a person who is suffering beyond what language can accommodate, the depth of what his family had lost. He spoke about who Yingying was. He spoke about her intelligence and her warmth and her dedication and her love for the people around her. He spoke about the last time he had seen her and the last time he had spoken to her and what those conversations had been about. He spoke about the future she had been building. He spoke about how proud he was of her. And he spoke, with a restraint that made what he was saying more rather than less powerful, about what he wanted, what the family wanted, what any family in their position would want and has the absolute right to want. They wanted Yinjing back. They wanted her remains. They wanted to be able to bring her home, to give her a proper burial, to complete the rituals of grief that allow the people who loved someone to begin the long, imperfect, never fully finished process of living in the world without them. They wanted the ability to say goodbye in the way that goodbye is meant to be said, with the body of the person present, with the finality that only physical reality can provide. Brent Christensen had said she would never be found, and in the immediate aftermath of that statement, and in the months that followed, it appeared that he might be right about that. The searches continued. Investigators looked, but Ying Zhang's remains were not found. The question of where they were, the question that Christensen himself was the only person who could definitively answer, remained open. It would remain open for a very long time. The legal proceedings moved through their preliminary stages in the fall and winter of 2017 and into 2018. Christensen appeared in court for arraignments and hearings, represented by federal public defenders who were doing the work that the legal system requires, ensuring that even a man accused of the worst possible things has competent legal representation. Because the integrity of the process depends on that principle holding even in the hardest cases. The charge remained kidnapping at first. But as the investigation deepened, as the evidence accumulated and the picture of what had actually happened became clearer and more fully documented, prosecutors moved toward a more serious charge. In June of 2018, almost exactly a year after Ying Zhang had disappeared, a federal grand jury returned a superseding indictment against Brent Christensen. The new indictment charged him with kidnapping resulting in death. This was the charge that reflected what investigators and prosecutors now believed, with the certainty that the evidence supported, had actually happened to Ying Zhang. It carried the possibility of the death penalty. The announcement of the superseding indictment was significant for multiple reasons. It signaled that prosecutors were confident in the strength of their case, confident enough to pursue the most serious possible charge, confident enough to put the full weight of the federal government behind the prosecution of this case. It also signaled that the case was moving toward a trial that would be unlike any that the Champaign, Urbana community had ever seen, a federal murder trial. In a case that had drawn national and international attention, involving a defendant who had been a member of the university community and a victim who had come from China to pursue a dream that he had destroyed. The trial was set for 2019. In the period between the indictment and the trial, something significant happened that would shape the proceedings in a way that few people anticipated. Brent Christensen changed his plea. He had maintained a not guilty plea through the preliminary proceedings. But as the trial date approached, as the evidence against him continued to solidify and the prospect of the full federal prosecution bearing down on him became concrete and unavoidable, something shifted. His legal team engaged with prosecutors. Discussions took place, and eventually Christensen indicated that he was willing to plead guilty. But there was a condition: he would plead guilty, which would remove the requirement for a jury to determine the question of his guilt, which would spare the family and the witnesses and the community the ordeal of the guilt phase of a trial, if the death penalty were taken off the table, if prosecutors agreed to seek life imprisonment rather than execution. This was a negotiation that placed the family of Ying Zhang in an extraordinarily difficult position, because it was not simply a legal decision. It was a decision that directly implicated their deepest desires and their deepest pain. The question of what punishment Brent Christensen deserved was not abstract to them. It was as personal and as urgent as any question they had ever faced. The family's position on the death penalty was something they expressed publicly and with great care. Yingjing's father said that what the family wanted, above all else, was not Christensen's death. What they wanted was information. What they wanted was to know what had happened to their daughter. What they wanted was for Brent Christensen to tell them where her remains were, so that they could bring her home. The plea negotiation ultimately did not result in the outcome that Christensen's legal team sought. Prosecutors declined to remove the death penalty from the table in exchange for a guilty plea. The negotiation broke down. The trial would proceed, and it would proceed as a full federal capital murder trial, a proceeding which a jury would first determine guilt, and then, if they found him guilty, determine the appropriate punishment. Life in prison, or death. The trial of Brent Christensen began on 8, 2019 in the federal courthouse in Urbana, Illinois. The courthouse is a modest building by the standards of federal institutions, a low-profile, functional structure that does not announce itself dramatically from the street, that does not have the imposing grandeur of some federal courthouses in larger cities. But inside it, in the summer of 2019, something was happening that was anything but modest. Something that drew observers and journalists and legal analysts from across the country. Something that Yingying Zhang's family had traveled from China to witness. The courtroom was full. Yingying's family sat together. Rongga Zhang and Lifeng Ye, who had been living in a state of suspended grief for 2 years, who had made multiple trips across the ocean to be present for the legal proceedings involving the man who had taken their daughter, sat in that courtroom and prepared to hear. In formal legal proceedings, the full account of what had happened to the child they had raised and loved and sent across the world in hope. Yingying's boyfriend Zheng Shu was also present. He had been, from the beginning, one of the people most visibly devastated by her disappearance, the person who had raised the alarm, who had spoken publicly about her, who had tried in every way available to him to ensure that the world did not forget her. He sat in that courtroom as a witness to the proceeding that would finally, in some form, deliver a reckoning for what had been done to her. The jury was seated. 12 citizens of the Central District of Illinois, selected through the careful and painstaking voir dire process that federal capital cases require, sworn to hear the evidence and apply the law and return a verdict that was honest and fair and grounded in what the evidence actually showed. Opening statements began. The prosecution's opening statement laid out the case in the clear, structured way that effective trial advocacy demands. The jury was told what the evidence would show: the surveillance footage, the digital record, the recording from the vigil, the forensic evidence, the testimony of witnesses. They were given the framework through which everything that followed would be organized. They were told that Brent Christensen had, with premeditation and deliberation, abducted Yingying Zhang on July 1, 2017. They were told that he had taken her to his apartment. They were told that he had killed her there. And they were told that what motivated him, what had driven him to plan this and carry it out, was something that the evidence would document in disturbing detail: a violent sexual fantasy that he had been developing and nurturing for months, a desire to commit exactly this kind of act that he had expressed explicitly in online postings that investigators had found, and that would be presented to the jury. The prosecution was not going to make this easy to hear. They were going to make it complete. The defense's opening statement argued what defenses in cases like this typically argue: that the evidence was not as clear or as overwhelming as the prosecution claimed, that the jury should reserve judgment until they had heard everything, that reasonable doubt existed and should be respected. It was, by the standards of the situation, a difficult case to defend. The evidence was extensive. The recording was damning. The digital record was extensive and specific. But the defense had an obligation to their client, and they fulfilled it. The jury listened to both sides. And then the evidence began. The first witnesses called by the prosecution included the investigators who had worked the case from the beginning, the FBI agents and local law enforcement officers who had built the evidentiary record, who had pulled the surveillance footage and identified the car, and found the darknet postings, and placed the recording equipment, and listened to the vigil conversation. They testified methodically and in detail, walking the jury through the sequence of events from the moment Yinjing Zhang was reported missing to the moment Brent Christensen was taken into custody. The footage was shown. The jury saw what the cameras had captured: Yinjing on the bus, Yinjing at the stop, Yinjing on the corner, and then the black Saturn Astra, and then the footage ending. The recording from the vigil was played, and when the jury heard Brent Christensen's voice, heard him telling his girlfriend, at a vigil for the woman he had killed, what he had done, the effect in that courtroom was one that observers described as almost physical: a collective stillness, a collective intake of breath, the kind of reaction that happens when a thing that has been described in words is suddenly made real by sound, by the actual voice of the actual person doing the actual thing. He had done it, in his own voice, in real time. The jury heard it. Then came the digital evidence. The postings from the Darknet forum were presented to the jury with the full context of when they had been made and what they contained. The jury read, in the careful and methodical way that juries read documentary evidence, what Brent Christensen had written in the weeks and months before July 1, 2017. They read his descriptions of what he wanted to do. They read the specificity of his planning. They read the language of a person who was not dabbling in fantasy, but was moving deliberately toward action. The impact of this evidence on the jury was significant, because it did something that the recording alone could not fully do. It established the timeline. It showed that this was not a man who had acted impulsively, who had made a terrible decision in a moment he could not control. It showed a man who had been planning this, who had wanted this, who had written about wanting it in terms that left nothing to interpretation: premeditation, deliberation, intent, the legal elements of first-degree murder, laid out not by witnesses or investigators but by the defendant himself, in his own words, in the written record he had left behind. But the most devastating testimony, the testimony that the observers in that courtroom and the journalists covering the trial would later describe as the moment the case turned from damning to overwhelming, was still to come. It came from someone who had been inside Brent Christensen's world in a way that no investigator or forensic expert could replicate. It came from a woman named Tara Bullis. Tara Bullis had been involved with Brent Christensen before the events of July 1, 2017. She had known him. She had spent time with him. And she had, during the course of that relationship, heard things from him that she had not known what to do with at the time. Things that, in the context of a criminal trial for the kidnapping and murder of Yinjing Zhang, took on a significance that was impossible to overstate. She testified about conversations she had had with Christensen, about things he had told her regarding his desires, his fantasies, his interest in violence against women. She testified about the specific nature of what he had expressed, not vaguely, not in terms that could be explained away, but specifically and explicitly, in ways that were consistent with everything else the prosecution had presented. And she testified about something else, something that would shift the trial into a new register entirely. Something that would make clear not just what Brent Christensen had done, but the full, unvarnished reality of what Yinjing Zhang had endured. Tara Bullis testified that Christensen had told her, in explicit detail, what he had done to Yinjing Zhang, what she described in that courtroom, what Brent Christensen had told her he had done, step by step, in the specific and clinical language of a person who felt no need to soften or obscure what he was describing. Was something that the people who heard it would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Yinjing Zhang's family was in that courtroom. They heard every word. There are moments in a courtroom that change the air in the room, not metaphorically, physically. The temperature seems to shift. The quality of the silence changes. The people sitting in the gallery and the jury box and the press benches stop thinking about where they are and what they are doing and become simply present. Simply witnesses to something that is happening in front of them that they did not fully anticipate and cannot fully process in real time. Something that lands in the body before it lands in the mind. Tara Bullis's testimony was one of those moments. She took the stand in the federal courtroom in Urbana, Illinois, in the summer of 2019, and she told the jury what Brent Christensen had told her. And what she described, what she recounted in the measured, careful language of a person who has been prepared by prosecutors to give testimony in a capital murder trial, who understands the weight of what she is saying and is trying to say it accurately and completely, was something that the courtroom had been moving toward since the first piece of evidence had been introduced, but that still, when it arrived, hit with a force that no amount of preparation could fully cushion. She testified that Christensen had told her about Yingying Zhang, about what had happened in his apartment on the afternoon of July 1, 2017. He had described it to her in detail, not in the agitated language of someone confessing under the pressure of guilt, not with any apparent distress or remorse, but with the particular flatness of a person for whom the event was something to be recounted, rather than something to be repented. He had told her what he had done to Yingying Zhang, how he had restrained her, how he had overpowered her, what he had done to her during the time she was alive in his apartment, and how he had killed her. He had told Tara Bullis that he had strangled Yingying Zhang, and he had told her, with a specificity that prosecutors would later argue was itself evidence of the deliberate and premeditated nature of what he had done, what had happened after Yingying Zhang was dead, what he had done with her remains, the steps he had taken to ensure that she would not be found. Yingying's family was in that courtroom when Tara Bullis said these things. Ronggao Zhang sat in that room and heard, for the first time, in formal public testimony, what had happened to his daughter in the last hours of her life. Lai Fengye sat beside her husband and heard the same things. They had known, in the way that grieving families come to know evidence before formally confirms them, that Yingying was gone. They had known since the vigil recording, since the arrest, since the long months of investigation had made the truth impossible to avoid. But knowing something and hearing it described in open court, in precise and clinical detail, are two entirely different experiences. One is the private knowledge that lives in the body, in the chest, in the sleepless early hours of the morning. The other is public. It is formal. It is stated in a room full of strangers and recorded in the official transcript of a federal proceeding and spoken aloud in a way that makes it permanently, irrevocably part of the record. The family held together. They had been holding together for 2 years. The particular strength required to do what they had been doing, to be present, to show up, to face this publicly, to sit in that courtroom and hear these things, and remain present in their grief rather than collapsing under it, was not a strength that anyone could have expected of them. They had not chosen to be strong. They had not decided that strength was the appropriate response. They were simply doing what parents do when the only alternative to endurance is something worse than endurance. They were staying. They were witnessing. They were refusing to leave their daughter's story to be told without them in the room. Tara Bullis had not come easily to this moment. Her path from the person who had heard these things from Brent Christensen to the person sitting in a federal witness box describing them to a jury was not a straight or simple one. She had known Christensen through a prior relationship. She had been, at various points, someone who was genuinely close to him, close in the way that people who are in relationships are close, in the way that involves trust and shared time, and the gradual construction of a picture of the other person that you believe, because you have no reason not to believe it, is reasonably complete. The picture she had built of Brent Christensen had not included what she would eventually learn about him. The things he had told her, the things about his desires and his fantasies and his interest in violence, had registered at the time, with the complicated uncertainty that characterizes most people's responses to disturbing disclosures within intimate relationships. People tell each other things. People in relationships share things that they would not share with the wider world. And the question of how to interpret those disclosures, how seriously to take them, how much weight to assign to the darkest things a partner says, that question does not always have an obvious answer in the moment. She had not known, when she heard those things from Christensen, that he was going to act on them. She had not known, could not have known, that the man sitting across from her was building toward something that would eventually land her in a federal courtroom as a witness in a capital murder trial. When investigators approached her, when the case against Christensen was being assembled and her potential value as a witness became clear, she cooperated. She told investigators what she knew. She told them what Christensen had said to her. She went through the difficult, painstaking process of preparing to testify, of sitting with federal prosecutors and going over her testimony until she could deliver it in a way that was accurate and that would hold up under cross-examination. And then she had gone into that courtroom and she had said it. The jury heard her. They heard the account of what Christensen had told her. They heard the specific details of what had happened to Yinjing Zhang. And they heard it not just as a description of a crime, but as a window into the mind of the person who had committed it, into the way Brent Christensen related to what he had done, the way he spoke about it, the complete and chilling absence of anything that resembled guilt or horror, or the ordinary human response to having ended another person's life. Let me step back for a moment from the courtroom. Let me step back from the testimony and the evidence and the formal proceedings of the trial. Because there is something that needs to be said about Brent Christensen that the trial itself, for all its comprehensiveness, could not fully explain. Something about who he was and how he had gotten to the place where he could do what he did. Understanding how a person becomes capable of this kind of act is not the same as excusing it. There is no explanation that excuses it. There is no background, no psychology, no sequence of circumstances that makes what Brent Christensen did to Yinjing Zhang acceptable or comprehensible in a way that diminishes his responsibility. He chose what he did. He planned it. He executed it with deliberation. Whatever else is true, that is true. But understanding or attempting to understand is not the same as excusing. And the attempt to understand is not just an intellectual exercise. It is, in some ways, a form of protection. Because the thing that makes cases like this most dangerous to the social fabric, most corrosive to the sense of safety that communities need to function, is the idea that predators like Brent Christensen are fundamentally mysterious. That they come from nowhere. That they cannot be identified or anticipated or stopped. The more we understand about how people like this develop and operate, the better equipped we are to recognize the patterns before they produce catastrophic outcomes. So Brent Christensen, he was born in 1988 in Champaign, Illinois. He grew up there, in the same university town where he would eventually attend school and pursue his doctoral degree and commit the crime whatever history remembers him for. He was, by the accounts of people who knew him in his early life, an ordinary child. There were no dramatic traumas in his background that announced themselves publicly, no obvious signs that he was developing into the person he would become. He was smart. He was reasonably sociable. He moved through childhood and adolescence without attracting the kind of attention, positive or negative, that gets remembered. He was good at school. Mathematics and the sciences came naturally to him. He pursued physics at the University of Illinois, a rigorous and demanding field that requires both intellectual ability and the capacity for sustained, focused work. He demonstrated both. His academic performance was solid enough to keep him in the doctoral program, to earn the respect of at least some of his advisors, to give him the credibility of a serious student. But parallel to the academic life, parallel to the surface of Brent Christensen as his colleagues and professors knew him, something else had been developing. Something that had been present, in various forms, for years before it culminated in what happened on July 1, 2017. The online postings were not a recent development. They were not something he had stumbled into in the months before the crime. They reflected an engagement with violent predatory content and a community of people who shared those interests that had been ongoing for some time. The investigators who examined his digital history found a pattern, not a sudden eruption of darkness, but a gradual intensification, a deepening engagement with material and communities that validated and amplified the desires he was developing. This is, unfortunately, a pattern that investigators and researchers who study violent predators recognize. The escalation is rarely sudden. It is typically slow. It involves increasing immersion in content and communities that normalize violent fantasies, that provide a social framework within which those fantasies can be shared and encouraged rather than recognized as disturbing and addressed. The person moves further in, becomes more committed, develops a more detailed and specific vision of what they want to do, and eventually reaches a threshold where the distance between fantasy and action becomes something they are willing to cross. Brent Christensen crossed that threshold on July 1, 2017. He crossed it when Yingying Zhang got into his car. The question of why he had been driving through that particular area on that particular afternoon is one that the evidence answered clearly. He had not been driving randomly. He had not been in that area by coincidence. He had been, by the account of his own online postings, and by the reconstruction of movements that investigators had pieced together, looking for an opportunity. He had been circling. He had been watching. He had been doing, in the physical world, the thing that his online presence suggested he had been doing in his imagination for a long time, looking for a woman who was alone, who was vulnerable, who could be approached without witnesses. Yingying Zhang was not chosen because of anything specific about her. This is important to understand, and it is also one of the most disturbing aspects of the case, because it means that what happened to her was not the result of any particular quality she possessed, any particular place she had been, any particular decision she had made that was reckless or unwise. She was in the wrong place at the wrong moment. She was a person who happened to be standing alone on a corner in Champaign, Illinois, on the afternoon that Brent Christensen happened to be driving past. She could have been anyone. That is not a comfortable thought. It is, in fact, one of the most uncomfortable thoughts that a case like this produces, the recognition that the terrible thing that happened to this specific person, this particular woman with this particular life, and these particular people who loved her, happened not because of anything that connects specifically to her, but because of the intersection of her ordinary afternoon with the predatory agenda of a man who had been moving toward this for a long time. She got into his car because he presented himself as someone who could help her get to her destination. She got in because she was late and she needed to get somewhere. And there was a car at the curb with a person inside who appeared to be offering assistance. She got in because nothing in the visible surface of Brent Christensen, not his age, not his appearance, not the car he was driving, not the way he spoke to her, gave her any reason to believe that getting in was anything other than the practical, pragmatic decision it appeared to be. She could not have known. The apartment to which Christensen took her was on a street near the campus. An ordinary apartment in an ordinary building of the kind that populates every university town. The kind of place that graduate students live, that has the slightly worn, slightly impersonal quality of rental housing that has been occupied by a succession of young people moving through their training years. From the outside, from the street, there was nothing about it that marked it as a place where anything was wrong. Inside, within a very short time of arriving, Yingying Zhang understood that something was catastrophically wrong. What she experienced in those minutes, what she went through, what she tried, is documented in the account that Christensen gave to Tara Bullis, and in the details that emerged from the forensic examination of the apartment, and in the testimony that would be presented during the trial. It is not necessary, and it would not be respectful to her memory, to recount every detail here. What can be said, and what should be said is this: she fought. Yingying Zhang did not go passively into what Brent Christensen had planned for her. The evidence is consistent with her having resisted. The evidence is consistent with someone who, in the most terrible and impossible of circumstances, did not surrender without fighting for her life. She was a small woman, physically smaller than Christensen, without any way to compensate for that physical disparity in the specific circumstances she found herself in. The outcome was not determined by effort or courage. The outcome was determined by the physical reality of the situation, a reality that Christensen had created and controlled from the beginning. But she fought, and that matters. It matters not because it changes anything about what happened, because it does not. It matters because Yingying Zhang was not passive in the face of what was being done to her. She was not a person who accepted her fate without resistance. She was, in those last terrible minutes of her life, exactly the person she had always been, determined, present, refusing to simply yield to something that should not have been happening to her. She died in that apartment. And then Brent Christensen did the things that he had told Tara Bullis he had done. The things that ensured she would not be found, that ensured her family would be denied the remains they needed to grieve completely, that extended the injury he had done to her out beyond her death and into the lives of everyone who loved her. The trial continued. After Tara Bullis's testimony, the prosecution moved through the remaining elements of their case with the methodical thoroughness that the circumstances demanded. Additional witnesses were called. Additional evidence was presented. The picture that had been built piece by piece over the preceding days of testimony was assembled into its final form. A complete and comprehensive account of what Brent Christensen had done, supported by evidence from every available category, documented in a way that left no significant gap for reasonable to occupy. The defense did what defenses in cases like this do. They cross-examined witnesses. They challenged evidence. They probed for inconsistencies and weaknesses and the kinds of procedural or evidentiary vulnerabilities that can, in some cases, create the openings that a defense needs. They were competent and they were thorough, and they did the job that the legal system requires of them. But the case against Brent Christensen was not a case with significant vulnerabilities. The evidence was extensive. The recording was direct. The digital record was specific and damning. The witness testimony was consistent and credible. The forensic evidence corroborated the account of events. And the defendant's own statements, the things he had said at the vigil, the things he had written online, the things he had told Tara Bullis, constituted a body of self-incrimination that the defense had very little ability to neutralize. The jury deliberated. They did not deliberate for long. On July 18, 2019, 10 days after the trial had begun, the jury returned its verdict: guilty. Guilty on the charge of kidnapping resulting in death. Guilty on all counts. The verdict was announced in that federal courtroom in Urbana. And the people who were present for it experienced it in the various ways that verdicts in cases like this are experienced. With relief that the legal system had functioned as it was supposed to. With grief that a verdict cannot undo what was done. With a complicated mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion, and the particular emotional flatness that comes after a long period of sustained intensity, finally reaches its formal conclusion. Ying Ying's family was present. They had been present for as much of the trial as they could be. They had sat in that courtroom through the testimony, and the evidence and the cross-examinations and the legal arguments. Had sat through all of it with a dignity and a composure that everyone who saw them remarked upon. A dignity that came not from indifference to what they were hearing, but from the particular strength of people who have decided that bearing witness is the most important thing they can do for the person they have lost. When the verdict was read, Rongao Zhang wept. He had been holding that grief at a controlled distance through the proceedings, had been maintaining the composure that the situation seemed to require, had been functioning as a public figure in a public process when every instinct must have been pulling him toward the private, the personal, the purely human response to having been told, in formal legal terms, what had been done to his child. When the verdict came, the composure gave way for a moment, only for a moment, because there was still the penalty phase to come. The phase of the trial that would determine not whether Brent Christensen was guilty, that had been settled, but what the appropriate punishment for his guilt was. Life in prison, or death. And for that phase, the family would need to be present again, would need to speak in the formal legal setting of a victim impact statement about what they had lost, would need to stand in front of the man who had taken their daughter and say, in whatever words they could find, what his actions had done to them. That was still coming, and it would be, in its own way, the most difficult part of all. The penalty phase of a capital murder trial is a different kind of proceeding from the guilt phase. The guilt phase is about evidence and law, and the formal determination of factual questions. Did the defendant do this thing? And does what he did meet the legal definition of the crime charged? The penalty phase is about something harder to formalize and harder to contain within legal structure. It is about value. It is about what a life is worth, and what the taking of a life deserves, and what the appropriate response of a civilized society is to the most serious crimes that members of that society commit against each other. In federal capital cases, the jury that determined guilt is also the jury that determines punishment. The same 12 people who had heard the evidence and returned the guilty verdict were now required to sit through a second phase of proceedings, one in which both sides would present evidence and argument relevant to the question of punishment, and at the end of which those 12 people would decide whether Brent Christensen should spend the rest of his natural life in federal prison or be executed. The prosecution presented aggravating factors, the legal elements that, under federal law, must be established for the death penalty to be available as a punishment. They presented evidence of the premeditated and deliberate nature of the crime. They presented the evidence of the online planning, the darknet postings, the long runway of preparation that had led to July 1st. They argued that what Brent Christensen had done was not merely a murder, but a murder committed with a particular quality of calculation and cruelty that placed it among the most serious offenses that the law recognizes. The defense presented mitigating factors. They presented evidence about Christensen's background, his mental health, his history. They presented testimony from family members and others who knew him, who spoke about him as a person, as a son, as a brother, as someone who had existed in the world in ways that were ordinary and even good before whatever had built inside him had led to what it led to. This is the part of a capital trial that is, for many observers, the most uncomfortable, not because the mitigating evidence is false, but because it forces a confrontation with the reality that even people who have done the worst possible things are also people. That the category of monster, however useful as a shorthand, is not actually a category that maps cleanly onto the complexity of a human being, however monstrous their actions. The jury was required to weigh all of it. And then the victim impact statements. Ying Zhang's family stood before that court and they spoke. Rongo Zhang stood at the podium in the federal courtroom in Urbana, Illinois, and he looked at the man who had taken his daughter, and he spoke to him directly. He spoke in Chinese, with a translator rendering his words into English for the court record, and what he said was not the formal language of legal proceedings. It was the language of a father. It was the language of grief that has been carried for 2 years across an ocean, and through a criminal investigation, and through a trial, and through the long terrible process of learning, piece by piece, what had been done to the child he had raised. He told Christensen what Yinjing had been. He told him about her intelligence, her warmth, her dedication, her love for the people around her. He told him about the last time he had spoken to her, and what they had talked about, and how she had sounded. He told him about the specific, irreplaceable texture of the relationship between a father and a daughter, the things that are said, and the things that do not need to be said, the particular quality of that bond that is unlike any other bond in a human life. And he told Christensen what he had destroyed, not in the abstract, not in the language of generalization or legal category, in the specific and concrete terms of a life that had existed and now did not, a future that had been forming and now was not, a family that had been whole and now had a wound in it that would never fully close, that would be carried by every member of that family for every day of the rest of their lives. Lai Feng Ye also spoke. She spoke as a mother. She spoke about what it means to carry a child, to raise a child, to watch a child grow into a person, and then send that person out into the world trusting that the world will hold them. She spoke about what it means to have that trust violated in the most complete and irreversible way possible. She spoke about the particular grief of a mother whose child's body had not been found, who could not perform the rituals of mourning that every tradition provides, because the physical reality necessary for those rituals had been deliberately and cruelly withheld. She wanted her daughter back. She said it plainly. She said it with the simplicity of someone who has moved past the complexity of everything surrounding a situation and arrived at the pure, unadorned core of what they need. She wanted her daughter's remains. She wanted to bring Ying home. She wanted to be able to stand at a grave and say goodbye in the way that goodbye is supposed to be said. Christensen, sitting at the defense table, showed very little visible reaction to any of this. The jury deliberated on the question of punishment, and when they returned, when they announced their decision, it was the decision that the prosecution had sought and that the family of Yinjing Zhang had, with the complicated and honest ambivalence that characterized their public statements about the death penalty throughout the proceedings, accepted as the formal conclusion of the legal process. The jury recommended the death penalty. Federal Judge James Shadid, presiding over the case, sentenced Brent Christensen to death. He would be placed on federal death row. He would remain there while the automatic appeals process that federal capital cases require ran its course. A process that can take years, that can take decades, that involves multiple layers of review, and the possibility of various legal challenges that can extend the period between sentence and execution almost indefinitely. Whether Brent Christensen will ultimately be executed is a question that the legal system has not yet finally answered. The appeals process continues. Federal executions are subject to policy decisions at the executive level as well as to the outcomes of legal challenges. The sentence is real. Whether it is carried out is something that will be determined over years, possibly decades, of legal proceedings that are still ongoing. What is not subject to further determination is the verdict. Brent Christensen is guilty of kidnapping resulting in the death of Ying Zhang. That is the formal, permanent, legally established fact. Whatever else happens, whatever appeals are filed and decided, whatever policy decisions are made about federal executions, whatever the ultimate fate of Brent Christensen turns out to be, that verdict stands. But there was one more thing. One more thing that happened in the period surrounding the trial, that the legal proceedings themselves could not capture, could not formalize, could not fully give to the family of Yinjing Zhang. Brent Christensen had said at that vigil that she would never be found. He had maintained that. Through the investigation, through the indictment, through the trial. The search for Ying Zhang's remains had continued, on and off, through the 2 years between her disappearance and the trial. Investigators had searched. They had looked in the places that the evidence suggested, and in the places that logic suggested, and in the places that nothing suggested, but they look anyway because you have to. Because the alternative to looking is accepting that you will never find what you are looking for. They had not found her. And then during the trial itself, during the penalty phase, in the period when the jury was determining what punishment Brent Christensen would receive, something happened that would change that. Christensen spoke. Not in open court. Not in formal testimony. He had exercised his right not to testify during the guilt phase, and he did not testify during the penalty phase either. But he communicated something to his legal team. Something that was then conveyed to investigators. Something that represented, for whatever reason, whether from some residual human impulse or from a calculation about how his cooperation might be viewed by the court, or for some other reason entirely that only he knows, a partial disclosure of information that investigators had been seeking for 2 years. He told them where to look. He told them where to look. Those 5 words. In the context of everything that had come before them, in the context of 2 years of searching and grieving, and the long terrible process of a federal murder trial, carried a weight that is almost impossible to overstate. Because finding Yinjing Zhang's remains was not simply an investigative objective. It was not simply a matter of closing an evidentiary gap, or completing a forensic record. It was something that her family had been asking for since the beginning. Something that Rongao Zhang had stood at podiums and microphones and said, in the plain and heartbreaking language of a grieving father, was what he needed. What his family needed. What his daughter deserved. A place to bring her home from. A place to say goodbye. And now, during the penalty phase of the trial of the man who had taken her, there was information. Partial. Incomplete. Filtered through the legal mechanisms of a capital proceeding. Conveyed through attorneys rather than directly. But information. A direction. Something that could be followed. Investigators followed it immediately. The search that followed was conducted with the urgency and the care that the circumstances demanded. When you have been looking for something for 2 years, when the searching has been ongoing and exhaustive and has produced nothing, and then a piece of information arrives that points you somewhere specific, the combination of hope and dread that produces is unlike almost anything else in human experience. Because finding is what you want. Finding is what the family needs. But finding also means confronting, in physical reality, the full and final confirmation of what you have been trying not to fully face. Investigators went to location that the information had indicated. What they found confirmed what the evidence had already established, what the testimony had already described, what the verdict had already legally determined. They found the remains of Yinjing Zhang. They were not intact. They had been, and this is where the description becomes difficult, because the truth of what Christensen had done after killing Yinjing Zhang was one of the most disturbing aspects of an already deeply disturbing case. They had been treated in a way that was deliberately intended to prevent identification and discovery. The steps he had taken, the methods he had used, the effort he had made to ensure that she could not be found, were documented in the testimony that had already been presented in court. The finding of her remains confirmed that testimony. It also confirmed something else. It confirmed that Brent Christensen had been right in a purely logistical sense when he had said she would never be found. That the measures he had taken were thorough enough that, without the information he eventually provided, the search might genuinely have gone on indefinitely without result. The remains were found because he disclosed the location. That disclosure was the only reason the family got what they had been asking for. That is a complicated thing to sit with. The family of Yinjing Zhang received something they needed, the ability to recover what remained of their daughter, because of a disclosure made by the man who had killed her. The man who had spent 2 years ensuring she would not be found. The man who had looked her father in the face, in that courtroom, and heard him say that all they wanted was to bring her home, and who had then, for whatever reason and with whatever calculation or impulse behind it, given investigators the information that made that possible. It was not enough. It could never be enough. But it was something. The remains of Yinjing Zhang were recovered in the summer of 2019, during the penalty phase of Brent Christensen's trial. The recovery was handled with the care and the dignity that the circumstances demanded, with the awareness that these were not simply evidence, not simply the physical components of an investigative conclusion, but the remains of a person, a daughter, a young woman who had crossed an ocean to pursue a dream, who had lived and worked and loved and photographed, and walked through the wide Illinois landscape with an open and curious and generous heart, whose presence in the world had meant something real and specific to the people who had known her, and whose absence had left a wound in those people that was still, after 2 years, as raw and as painful as it had been in the first hours. The recovery was communicated to her family, and Rongao Zhang and Li Fingyi, who had been in that courtroom in Urbana hearing the penalty phase testimony, who had been enduring the final stretch of the formal legal process that had consumed 2 years of their lives. They received the news that their daughter had been found, that the part of her that remained in the physical world had been located and recovered and would be coming home. There is no word for what that moment must have been like. There is no word for the specific emotional experience of a parent who has been searching for their child's remains for 2 years and finally learns that the searching is over. It is not relief exactly, because relief implies the resolution of a tension, and the tension that Yinjing's death had created in her family would never fully resolve. It is not happiness, because happiness is the wrong category entirely. It is something more like the ability to begin. The ability to begin the formal ritual process of grief that every culture provides and that requires, at its foundation, a physical reality to anchor it. They could bury their daughter. They could bring her home to Nanping, to the mountains of Fujian province, to the place where she had grown up, and where her family would be able to visit her grave, and sit with her and say that people say, when they go to visit the graves of the people they have loved. That was what they had asked for from the beginning. That was what had been denied to them for 2 years, by the deliberate actions of the man who had killed her. And now they had it. The penalty phase of the trial concluded in late July 2019. The jury had heard the aggravating factors presented by the proditation, the planning, the darknet record, the deliberate and calculated nature of what Christensen had done. They had heard the mitigating factors presented by the defense, the evidence about his background, his mental health, the testimony of people who knew him in ways that complicated the simple category of monster. They had sat with all of it, had deliberated over it, had done the impossible work that the legal system asks of 12 ordinary citizens when it places them in a room and asks them to decide whether another human being should live or die. They returned a recommendation: death. The jury recommended that Brent Christensen be sentenced to death for the kidnapping and murder of Yingying Zhang. Federal Judge James Shadid accepted the jury's recommendation and imposed the sentence of death. Brent Christensen, 29 years old at the time of sentencing, was remanded to federal custody to await execution on federal death row. The formal legal proceedings were over. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death. The man who had taken Yingying Zhang from the world on a summer afternoon in Champaign had been found, tried, convicted, and sentenced in a process that had taken 2 years and that had exposed, in painstaking public detail, every aspect of what he had done and how he had done it, and what kind of person had been capable of doing it. The case was closed in the legal sense, but the story was not over. Because the story of what happened to Yingying Zhang is not only a story about a crime and a trial. It is a story about a family, about what a family endures when one of its members is taken from the world violently and without warning, about how people survive that endurance, about what they do with the love that has nowhere to go after the person it was directed toward is gone. And that part of the story was still unfolding. Ronggao Zhang had become, in the 2 years between his daughter's disappearance and the conclusion of her trial, something that he had never sought to be, and something that the circumstances had made unavoidable. He had become a public figure, not in the way that people become public figures through ambition or talent, or the pursuit of visibility, in the involuntary and painful way that the families of crime victims sometimes become public figures, through the necessity of speaking, of advocating, of refusing to let the case disappear from public consciousness, of making sure that the institutions and the media and the broader public did not move on from Yingying's story before the story had been fully told, and before the justice it demanded had been fully pursued. He had spoken to reporters. He had given interviews. He had made public statements at critical moments in the investigation and the legal proceedings. He had stood at podiums and in front of cameras looking like exactly what he was, a man in profound grief, a man carrying something that should not have to be carried, a man who had come to a foreign country to fight for his daughter, because fighting was the only thing he could do, and he was going to do it with everything he had. He had done all of this while also simply being a person, a father, a husband, a man who had his own grief to manage, his own sleepless nights, his own private hours with the reality of what had happened. The public face he presented, the dignified, composed, determined face of a father seeking justice, was real. But it was not all of him. It was what he offered to the world because the world needed it, and because Yingying deserved it. What was underneath it, the full weight of what he was carrying privately, was something that only the people closest to him would ever fully see. His wife, Li Fengye, had endured alongside him. She had been present at the trial. She had given her victim impact statement. She had spoken about what it meant to be Yingying's mother, about what had been taken from her, about the specific and irreplaceable quality of the relationship between a mother and a daughter that no legal proceeding and no sentence can restore or replace. Yingying's brother had endured too. The younger sibling who had grown up alongside her, who had shared the specific intimacy of a childhood home with her, who had known her in the way that siblings know each other, not through the polished public presentation but through the ordinary, daily, uncurated reality of living in proximity to another person, had to carry the loss in the particular way that siblings carry loss, different from what parents carry, different from what a romantic partner carries. The particular grief of someone who has lost a sibling is its own thing, its own shape, its own texture. It does not fit neatly into any other category. Zhen Shu, Yinjing's boyfriend, had also endured. He had been one of the first people to raise the alarm when she did not come home. He had spoken publicly about her in the early days of the search. He had been present for the legal proceedings. He had carried, through all of it, the particular grief of someone who had loved a person and lost them to violence, the grief that is complicated by the specific nature of the loss, by the fact that what happened to her was not illness or accident, but deliberate human cruelty, by the knowledge that someone had looked at the person you loved and decided to destroy them. He had, in the years following the trial, continued to speak about Yingying when the opportunity arose. Continued to insist on the reality and the fullness of her life, on the person she had been beyond the victim label that her case had attached to her name. He had known her. He had loved her. And the version of her that lived in his memory was not the version that court documents and news articles described. It was the version that had walked beside him through the streets of Champaign and cooked food in a small apartment kitchen and taken photographs of the wide Illinois sky and talked about the future with the particular excitement of a person who could see it clearly ahead of her. That version of Yingying Zhang was the real one. That was the one that mattered. And Zheng Shu's commitment to keeping that version alive in the world, to insisting, in whatever ways were available to him, that the world remember her as a person and not only as a case, was itself a form of love that continued past her death and past the trial and into the years that followed. The University of Illinois responded to the case in the way that large institutions respond to things that happen within their community, that are both terrible in themselves and deeply complicated in their institutional implications. There were statements, there were memorials, there were discussions about campus safety and about the particular vulnerabilities of international students, who often navigate their environments without the full network of local knowledge and community connection that domestic students typically have. The campus established a memorial for Yingying Zhang, a physical space where her name and her memory could be present in the place where she had studied and worked and built the beginning of an academic life. A space where the people who had known her could come and sit with her absence in a way that the absence of a grave, for the long period before her remains were recovered, had made difficult. The memorial was not enough. Memorials are never enough. They are what communities can do. They are gestures of acknowledgement and respect and refusal to forget. But they cannot restore what was lost, and they cannot fill the space that a person leaves behind when they are gone from the world violently and too soon. The discussions about campus safety and the safety of international students were more substantive. The case had exposed something that universities across the country were forced to confront, that the assumption of safety within an academic community is not simply a matter of the physical security infrastructure of a campus, but of the human infrastructure, the networks of connection and communication and community that can, in some circumstances, provide a layer of protection by ensuring that people are not navigating their environments entirely alone. Yingying Zhang had been alone on that corner. She had been alone in the specific sense of being without anyone who knew her in that immediate vicinity, without anyone who might have noticed what was happening and intervened. She had been alone in the broader sense of being an international student in a foreign country, still in the process of building the kind of deep, established community connections that might have changed the texture of that particular afternoon in ways that could not be predicted. None of this is blame. None of this is an argument that Yingying Zhang did anything wrong or failed to take any precaution she should have taken. She was a young woman walking in a university town in the middle of the afternoon. She had the right to be there. She had the right to be safe there. What happened to her was not a consequence of any failure on her part. It was a consequence of the deliberate predatory action of the man who had planned to do exactly what he did. But the conversations that her case prompted about how universities support international students, about how communities build the connections that make people more visible to each other, about how institutions recognize and respond to the particular vulnerabilities that international students sometimes face, were real and important conversations. And the fact that they happened, that Ying Zhang's case became a catalyst for those conversations, is part of her legacy in a world that she should still have been living in. Her legacy. It is a strange word to use about a 26-year-old woman who was killed in the middle of the life she was building. Legacy is a word we typically associate with people who have had time to build something, to complete something, to leave a body of work or a body of impact that persists after they are gone. Ying Zhang was 26 years old. She had not had time to complete her doctorate. She had not had time to publish the research she was developing. She had not had time to do the things that people in her field do over careers that span decades, the papers, the collaborations, the students they mentor, the contributions to the slow and patient accumulation of human understanding that is the real business of science. She did not get that time. But she left something anyway. Not in the form of publications or professional achievements. In the form of the people who loved her and who were changed by loving her and by losing her. In the form of the public record of her life that the trial and the coverage of her case created, a record that, for all its darkness, also contains within it the testimony of the people who knew her, the descriptions of who she was, and how she moved through the world, and what she meant to the people around her, in the form of her photographs. The images she took of the campus and the sky and the landscape of central Illinois during the years she spent there, those images exist. They are a record of the way she saw the world, of the particular quality of attention she brought to her environment, of the fact that she was, right up until the moment she disappeared, a person who was looking at the world and finding it worth documenting, in the form of her family's advocacy. Because Ramajan did not stop, after the trial, after the sentencing, after the recovery of his daughter's remains. He did not return to Nanping and close the door on what had happened and try to forget it. He could not have done that even if he had wanted to. What had happened to Yinjing was too large, too permanent, too woven into everything that his life now was to be contained or managed or put away. He kept speaking. He kept saying her name. And eventually, in the years following the trial, that speaking took on a specific and formal shape that transformed his grief into something that extended beyond the personal and into the world in a way that would have made Yinjing, who had believed in the work, who had believed that effort and dedication could contribute something real to human understanding, proud. In 2021, Rongao Zhang and Yinjing's family, in partnership with the University of Illinois, and with the support of the broader academic community that had been affected by her case, established the Ying Zhang Foundation. The foundation's mission was, and is, centered on the safety and support of international students at American universities. It works to build the kinds of community infrastructure and support networks that can reduce the isolation that international students sometimes experience. It advocates for policies and practices that make campuses genuinely safer and more supportive for the students who come from other countries, who leave their families and their communities behind, who navigate the specific challenges of building a life in a foreign environment while also doing the demanding intellectual work that graduate school requires. The foundation provides resources. It funds programs. It connects students with the kinds of support that Yinjing herself might have benefited from. Not because she was lacking in any way. Not because anything she did or failed to do contributed to what happened to her. But because the broader goal of making university campuses safer for international students is a goal worth pursuing regardless of the specific circumstances of any individual case. It is, in the most concrete and practical sense, the transformation of grief into action. The conversion of the energy that might otherwise be consumed entirely by loss into something that is directed outward. Into the world, toward the prevention of future losses. Rongao Zhang has spoken about this work in terms that are both simple and profound. He has said that he does this for Yinjing, that he continues because she cannot, that the work the foundation does is, in some sense, a continuation of what attribution to the world, made in her name. That reflects the values and the commitments that she carried into her own work. She believed in contributing something real. He is contributing something real in her name, in the world she should still be living in. The Yingying Zhang case also had a significant impact on how federal law enforcement approaches cases involving missing international students. The speed with which the FBI became involved in the investigation, within days of her disappearance, and the resources that were brought to bear on identifying and arresting Brent Christensen were partly a function of the specific circumstances of the case and partly a function of the commitment of the investigators involved. But the case also prompted broader conversations within law enforcement about protocols and resources for missing persons cases involving international students, about the particular challenges those cases present, and about how to ensure that the full resources of the investigative infrastructure are available when they are needed. These conversations mattered. They are ongoing. They do not have simple conclusions or easy policy answers, but the fact that they are happening, the fact that Yingying Zhang's case is part of the institutional memory of the people who think about these questions and make these decisions, is itself a form of impact, a form of the world being changed, however incrementally, by what happened to her. There is one more thing that needs to be said about this case before we move toward the parts of it that remain unresolved, the parts that continue to unfold, the parts that are still, years after the trial and the sentencing and the recovery of her remains, not fully finished. It is about what was taken, not in the legal sense, not in the forensic sense, not in the sense that the prosecution documented in evidence and the jury evaluated in their deliberations. In the most personal and specific sense, in the sense of the actual content of what was lost when Yingying Zhang died in that apartment in Champaign, Illinois, on the afternoon of July 1, 2017. She had been, in the period immediately before her death, in communication with her academic advisor about her research. She had been developing a body of work in atmospheric sciences that her colleagues and supervisors believed had genuine promise. She had been asking questions and pursuing lines of inquiry that, given time and the continued development of her skills and her knowledge, might have led somewhere important. The specific content of her research, the questions she was asking about the atmosphere, the models she was developing, the data she was analyzing, would never be completed. The papers she might have written would never be written. The contribution she might have made to her field would never be made. This is true of every person who dies young. Every life cut short contains within it the ghost of everything that life might have produced, might have become, might have contributed. The ghost of Yingying Zhang's unmade career in atmospheric science is not unique in its existence. It is one of countless such ghosts. But it is specific. It belonged to a specific person with a specific mind and a specific set of questions about the world. She might have contributed something real to our understanding of the atmosphere, of the climate, of the systems that govern the air we all breathe. We will never know exactly what. Because she was taken at 26 by a man with no interest in what she might become, no awareness of what he was destroying, no consideration of anything beyond the terrible satisfaction of his own predatory agenda. She had a life that was worth living. She had work that was worth doing. She had people who loved her, and all of it was taken. The appeal process for Brent Christensen's death sentence began, as it automatically does in federal capital cases, in the period following his sentencing. Federal capital appeals are extraordinarily complex legal proceedings that can take many years and involve multiple levels of review, direct appeals, habeas corpus petitions, constitutional challenges to the death penalty itself, and to the specific circumstances of the sentencing. The process is designed to be thorough, because the stakes are the highest stakes that the legal system deals with, and thoroughness is what the gravity of those stakes demands. As of the time of this telling, Brent Christensen remains on federal death row. The appeals process has continued. Various legal challenges have been filed and are being evaluated. The ultimate resolution of the question of whether his death sentence will be carried out remains, as it does in all federal capital cases, subject to legal proceedings and to the policy decisions of the federal government regarding the administration of capital punishment. None of that changes the verdict. None of that changes what he did. None of that changes what was done to Yingying Zhang or to the family that loved her. Those things are fixed. They are in the record. They are permanent in the way that the worst things that happen in the world are permanent, not because they cannot be survived or moved past, or transformed into something other than pure destruction, but because they cannot be undone. The loss is real. The harm is real. The absence of Yingying Zhang from the world is real and ongoing and fought every day by the people who loved her. The only question that the appeals process and the administration of his sentence will eventually resolve is what happens to Brent Christensen. And whatever happens to him, whatever the final disposition of his sentence turns out to be, it will not bring her back. Nothing will bring her back. But she is not gone in every sense. She is not gone in the sense that matters most to the people who carry her memory. She is not gone from her father's mind, where her voice still lives and where the specific texture of knowing her, of being her father, of having raised her and watched her grow and seen her become the person she was, continues to exist in the way that the people we love continue to exist in us after they are gone from the world. She is not gone from her mother, who carries her daughter's absence with a particular weight that only a mother knows. She is not gone from her brother from Zhongshu, from the friends and colleagues who knew her in Champaign, and who have not forgotten the specific quality of her presence. She is not gone from the foundation that bears her name, which continues to work in the world in the way she would have worked in the world, with care and dedication, and the belief that effort directed toward something real can make a genuine difference. She is not gone from the people who hear her story for the first time and feel, in hearing it, something that is both grief and recognition. The recognition that she was a person, fully and completely, and that what happened to her was an outrage that deserves to be remembered, and named and refused to be normalized or minimized or forgotten. She is not gone from the record. Her name is Yingying Zhang. She was born in Nanping, Fujian Province, China. She was 26 years old. She loved science and photography and the people around her. She crossed an ocean to pursue a dream that was worth pursuing. She was taken from the world by a man who had no right to take her. She deserved more time. She deserved so much more time. Federal death row is not a place that most people will ever see. It is not a place that announces itself to the world with any drama or visibility. It exists in the bureaucratic and institutional infrastructure of the federal prison system in a way that is deliberately removed from public view, not hidden exactly, but contained, managed, kept at a distance from the ordinary functioning of the world in a way that reflects the particular legal and moral gravity of what it represents. The men who live there are men who have been found guilty of the most serious crimes that federal law recognizes, who have been sentenced to death by juries of their peers in proceedings that carried every procedural protection that the Control Statute provide, and who are now waiting, in the particular and indefinite way that people on death row wait, for a resolution that may come years or decades from now, or that may never come at all. Brent Christensen arrived on federal death row at the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute, Indiana in the summer of 2019. Following his sentencing in the Urbana Federal Courthouse. Terre Haute is a city in western Indiana, about an hour's drive west of Indianapolis, sitting on the bank of the Wabash River in a landscape that is not unlike the landscape of central Illinois. Flat, agricultural, the kind of country that stretches out to the horizon in every direction, and that has its own particular beauty if you know how to look for it. The Federal Correctional Complex there houses, among other facilities, the United States Penitentiary that serves as the location for federal death row and for federal executions. It is a place that has been the site of some of the most significant executions in American federal history. It is where Brent Christensen now lives, in the specific and constrained sense in which a person on death row lives, in a cell with limited movement, with the particular texture of institutional existence that has no reference point in ordinary life, with the knowledge that the question of whether he will ever leave that place under his own power is one that the court are still in the process of answering. The federal appeals process in capital cases is one of the most complex and extensive legal mechanisms in the American system. It exists because the stakes are absolute, because a mistake in a death penalty case is by definition irreversible in a way that no other legal error is, and because the legal and moral weight of that irreversibility demands a level of review that is commensurate with what is at stake. The process begins with the direct appeal, the initial review of the conviction and sentence by the federal appeals court with jurisdiction over the case. For Brent Christensen, this is the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, which sits in Chicago and which has jurisdiction over federal cases from Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. The direct appeal examines the trial record for legal errors, for constitutional violations, for evidentiary rulings that were incorrect, for procedural problems that may have affected the fairness of the proceedings. It is a thorough review, conducted by appellate judges who examine the record with care, and who apply the relevant law to the specific facts of the case. The direct appeal in the Christensen case was filed in the period following his sentencing. It raised the kinds of arguments that defense attorneys typically raise in capital appeals: challenges to specific evidentiary rulings, arguments about the jury selection process, constitutional arguments about the administration of the death penalty. Some of these arguments are stronger than others. Some of them reflect genuine legal questions that the appellate courts will take seriously and evaluate carefully. Others are arguments that have been made in many capital appeals before this one, and that have not succeeded, but that the defense is obligated to raise because the exhaustion of legal remedies is a prerequisite for later stages of the appeals process. The direct appeal does not stop there even if it fails at the circuit court level. A defendant whose direct appeal is rejected by the circuit court can petition the United States Supreme Court to review the case. The Supreme Court has discretion over which cases it accepts. It is not obligated to hear any particular appeal, but it will sometimes grant review in capital cases where there is a significant constitutional question at stake, or where the circuit courts have reached conflicting conclusions on an important legal issue. Beyond the direct appeal lies the habeas corpus process, a separate avenue of legal challenge that allows a prisoner to argue that continued incarceration is constitutionally impermissible. Federal habeas corpus petitions in capital cases can raise a wide range of issues, including claims of ineffective assistance of counsel, claims that newly discovered evidence undermines the conviction, and claims that the constitutional standards for the administration of the death penalty have not been met. The habeas process can itself generate multiple rounds of appeals, and it is not unusual for federal capital cases to remain in active litigation for 15, 20, or even 30 years after the original sentence. This is the landscape that Brent Christensen's case now occupies. A landscape of ongoing legal proceedings, of arguments being made and evaluated and decided, of the slow and meticulous machinery of the federal appellate system working through the questions that the defense has raised. It is not a landscape that moves quickly. It is not a landscape that produces dramatic or visible developments on any regular basis. It is the legal equivalent of the flat agricultural land surrounding the institutions where this case was born and tried and quiet, and moving at a pace that can feel from the outside. But it is not stillness. It is work. Careful, detailed, legally serious work conducted by people who understand what is at stake and who are applying the full resources of their expertise to the questions before them. One of the significant legal questions that the Christensen appeals have engaged with involves the admissibility and use of evidence from the Darknet forum postings. This was an issue that the defense raised during the trial, the argument that the postings, whatever their content, could not properly be used in the way the prosecution used them, or that their introduction violated the defendant's constitutional rights in some way. The trial court ruled against these arguments, allowing the evidence to be presented. The defense preserved these objections for appeal, as attorneys are trained to do, and they have continued to press these arguments at the appellate level. The legal questions around Darknet evidence are, genuinely, ones that the courts are still working through. The internet, and particularly the darker and more anonymous corners of it, presents evidentiary and constitutional questions that existing legal frameworks were not designed to address. Questions about reasonable expectations of privacy, about the methods by which evidence from these platforms is collected and preserved, about the chain of custody for digital evidence, and the standards by which its authenticity is established. These are questions that different courts have answered in different ways, and that the appellate process in cases like this one contributes to resolving over time. None of this means that the evidence in the Christensen case was improperly obtained or improperly used. The trial court evaluated these questions carefully and concluded that the evidence was admissible. The appellate process will evaluate whether that conclusion was correct. But the existence of these legal arguments, and the seriousness with which the appellate courts will evaluate them, reflects something important about how the legal system is designed to function, not to produce quick or simple outcomes, but to produce outcomes that have been subjected to the level of scrutiny that the stakes demand. There is another aspect of the Christensen case that has generated significant legal and policy discussion in the years since the trial: the question of the death penalty itself. The United States has a complicated and contested relationship with capital punishment. The federal death penalty exists alongside a patchwork of state laws that range from states that apply capital punishment regularly to state entirely or that maintain it on the books but have not executed anyone in decades. The constitutional framework governing the death penalty has evolved significantly over the past 50 years, through a series of Supreme Court decisions that have placed limits on when and how it can be applied, prohibiting its use for crimes other than murder, prohibiting its use against defendants who are intellectually disabled or who were juveniles at the time of the crime, and placing procedural requirements on capital proceedings that continue to be refined and clarified. The federal death penalty went through a period of suspension under the Obama administration, during which no federal executions were carried out. The Trump administration resumed federal executions in 2020, carrying out a number of executions in the final months of the administration. The Biden administration then declared a moratorium on federal executions while the Department of Justice conducted a review of the policies and procedures governing them. Brent Christensen was sentenced to death in 2019 during the Trump administration. His case passed through the initial period of the Biden administration's moratorium without execution. The policy landscape around federal executions continues to evolve, and the question of when or whether his sentence will be carried out is one that is subject to forces that extend beyond the specific legal proceedings in his case. This is not an abstract question for Yinying Zhang's family. They have been asked about it. They have had to think about it and respond to it publicly, in the way that the families of murder victims who are sentenced to death are inevitably asked to engage with the broader policy debate around capital punishment that surrounds their specific, personal, and irreducibly human experience. Yinying's father has spoken about this with a restraint and a thoughtfulness that reflects the depth of his engagement with the question. He has said that what the family wanted from the legal process was not a specific punishment but accountability, acknowledgement, the formal public, legally established recognition that what was done to his daughter was wrong, was criminal, was deserving of the most serious possible legal response. He has said that what mattered most to him was not the specific form of the sentence, but the fact that the sentence was serious, that the law had taken seriously what had happened to Yinying, had treated her life as something of full and irreplaceable value, had responded to her murder with the weight that the loss of her deserved. He has also said, more than once, that what he truly wanted, above and beyond any particular sentence, above and beyond any legal outcome, was to understand why. To understand what had led a young man, who was pursuing a doctoral degree at a prestigious university, who was living an ordinary, seeming life in an ordinary, seeming community, to do what he had done to his daughter. To understand the mechanism, the pathway, the sequence of whatever it was, psychology, circumstance, choice, the development of violent predatory desire, the failure of whatever internal or external checks might have intervened, that had produced the person who had gotten into that car on July 1, 2017. He has never been given that understanding, not completely. Not in a way that satisfies the depth of the question, and he has had to find a way to live with that. The question of why Brent Christensen became capable of what he did is one that psychologists, criminologists, and researchers who study violent offenders have engaged with in the years since the trial. Not because the Christensen case is unique in its broad outlines. Predatory violence against women is, tragically, not rare, and the general features of predatory behavior are well studied, but because the specific circumstances of his case illuminate certain patterns with particular clarity. The role of online communities in the development and validation of violent fantasy is one of the most significant and concerning of those patterns. Researchers who study the pathways that lead individuals toward violent action have documented, in a growing body of literature, the way in which online communities can function as accelerants. Not as causes. The desire for violence, the specific predatory orientation toward women that Christensen manifested, was already present before the online community engagement began, but as accelerants, as environments that validate rather than challenge, that provide social reinforcement for desires that healthy social environments would isolate and discourage, that allows someone who is developing violent predatory ideation to feel less alone in that development, to feel that their desires are shared and understandable rather than aberrant and horrifying. The Darknet forum where Christensen posted was exactly this kind of environment. It was a place where men who wanted to commit violence against women found each other and found, in each other's responses, a kind of permission, a normalization, the sense that the thing they wanted was something others wanted too, that the desire was part of a community rather than a solitary pathology. And that normalization, that sense of community around violent desire, is, the research suggests, one of the factors that can push someone from prolonged fantasy toward action. This is not an excuse. It is an explanation, partial and incomplete and insufficient in the way that all explanations of human violence are insufficient. Brent Christensen chose what he did. He drove to that area deliberately. He approached Yingying Zhang deliberately. He took her to his apartment deliberately. He killed her deliberately. Every step of what he did was a choice, made by a person with the capacity to make different choices, who made the choices he made for reasons that are rooted in something that was his own desire, his own planning, his own decision to act. But the environment in which that desire was nurtured and that planning was developed is not irrelevant. It is part of the picture. And the recognition that online spaces can play this role, that the internet, in its darker corners, can function as an incubator for violent predatory development, is a recognition that has policy implications for how platforms are designed and moderated, implications for how law enforcement monitors these spaces and responds to the kinds of postings that Christensen made, implications for how mental health professionals, educators, and communities recognize and respond to signs of developing violent ideation before it reaches the threshold of action. These are hard problems. They do not have simple solutions. But the Christensen case has contributed to the body of evidence and the body of discussion that informs the people working on these problems. That too is part of what Yingying Zhang's case has left in the world, not a solution to the problem, but a data point. A clear and well-documented example of how the development of violent predatory behavior can look from the outside. What the warning signs were that might have been noticed if the right people had been looking, and what the consequences are when they are not. The safety of international students on American university campuses is an issue that the Yingying Zhang case brought the center of national attention, and that has remained there in the academic and policy communities that think about these questions ever since. The numbers are significant. There are hundreds of thousands of international students enrolled in American universities at any given time. They contribute enormously to the intellectual and cultural life of those institutions. They bring perspectives and knowledge and ways of seeing that enrich the academic community in ways that are both documented and difficult to fully quantify. They also face specific challenges of language and cultural navigation, challenges of building community in an unfamiliar environment, challenges of understanding and accessing the full range of support services that their institutions offer. One of those challenges, which the Yining Jiang case illuminated with particular sharpness, is the challenge of navigating an unfamiliar physical and social environment without the depth of local knowledge that domestic students typically have. Yining Jiang missed her bus stop on the afternoon of July 1, 2017. That was a small thing, a human and ordinary thing. But it placed her in a position of vulnerability that was partly a function of her still developing familiarity with the city she had been living in for a year. A person with deeper roots in Champaign might have had different resources in that moment, might have known the area better, might have had more local contacts to call, might have had a denser network of people who would have noticed more quickly that something was wrong. This is not a criticism of Yining Jiang. It is an observation about the specific circumstances of international students that institutions can do something about. They can invest in the kinds of orientation and support programming that helps international students build local knowledge more quickly. They can create the kinds of community infrastructure that ensures international students have real connections, not just institutional connections but human ones, from early in their time at the institution. They can make sure that the particular challenges of being far from home, in a new country, in an unfamiliar city, are understood and addressed rather than treated as the student's own problem to manage. The Yining Jiang Foundation has been central to the advocacy for these kinds of changes, working with universities across the country, engaging with academic administrators and student affairs professionals, raising the profile of international student safety as a genuine institutional priority rather than a peripheral concern. This has been the work of the Foundation in the years since the trial. It is slow work, it is institutional work. It does not produce dramatic visible results in the short term. But it is the kind of work that, over time, changes the culture and the practices of institutions in ways that make a real difference to real people. In China, the impact of Yining Jiang's case was profound and lasting. China has a large and growing population of students who study abroad, particularly in the United States. The community of Chinese students and scholars at American universities is one of the largest and most visible international student communities in the country, and it is embedded in a network of family connections and community relationships in China. That means that what happens to these students is felt not just by the individuals involved, but by the broader community from which they come. Yining Jiang's disappearance and death were followed closely in China. The case received extensive media coverage. It prompted discussions in Chinese public life about the safety of Chinese students studying abroad, about the responsibilities of American institutions toward the international students they recruit, about the particular vulnerabilities that young women face in environments where they are far from their support networks. These discussions were not always comfortable or uncomplicated. They touched on questions of race, of the treatment of Chinese nationals by American institutions and the American legal system, of whether the response to Yining Jiang's disappearance had been as swift and as resourced as it would have been had she been an American citizen. These are questions that do not have simple answers, and the evidence about what the investigation and the legal proceedings actually looked like suggests that the response was in fact serious and committed, that the FBI became involved quickly, that investigators pursued the case with genuine urgency, that the legal outcome was as serious as the crime demanded. But the fact that these questions were asked, that the Chinese public and the Chinese American community engaged with the case through the lens of the specific vulnerabilities of Chinese students in America, is itself significant. It reflects a broader conversation about how international students are treated and protected that is ongoing and important. Yining's family has been central to that conversation. They have spoken, in China and in the United States, about what happened to their daughter in ways that have reached audiences far beyond the immediate community of people affected by the case. They have spoken about the importance of international cooperation in cases involving foreign students, about the responsibilities of universities toward the students they recruit from other countries, about the specific support that students from China and other countries need when they are navigating unfamiliar environments. They have done this while also grieving, while also carrying the loss, while also doing the ordinary work of continuing to live in the world, after the most devastating thing that can happen to a family has happened to them. The town of Champaign itself was changed by what happened, not dramatically, not visibly to someone passing through who did not know the history. The streets look the same. The campus looks the same. The MTD buses run the same routes. The students arrive each fall and depart each spring in the same rhythms that have always governed university life. The enormous flat sky over central Illinois continues to change through its seasons, the deep blue of summer giving way to the kratom, the white of winter, the tentative green of spring. But the people who were there, who were part of the community, when Yinjing Zhang disappeared, and when the investigation unfolded, and when the trial happened, and when the truth came out, those people carry something that is part of them now. The graduate students who put up flyers and attended vigils and searched and waited. The faculty members who knew her or who taught students who knew her. The administrators who had to navigate the institutional response to something that the institution had no template for. The investigators and prosecutors who built the case. The jurors who sat through the trial and carried the weight of the decision they were asked to make. And the international students who were there at the time and who are there now, for whom Yinjing Zhang's story is not historical but personal, not something that happened to someone else a long time ago in a different world, but something that happened here, on this campus, in this community, to a person who is doing what they are doing. Something that could have happened to any one of them on any ordinary afternoon. They carry that knowledge too, and what they do with it, whether it makes them more fearful or more connected, whether it isolates them or motivates them to build the kinds of community that make everyone safer, is part of the ongoing story of what Yinjing Zhang's case has left in the world. There is a photograph that has become, in the years since her death, the image most associated with Yinjing Zhang in the public record. It is a photograph of her smiling. She is outdoors, and there is light in the image. And she is looking at the camera with the particular quality of a person who is fully present in the moment, not performing a smile for documentation, but simply happy. Simply there, simply herself. It is the photograph that her family uses. It is the photograph that appears in news articles and memorial tributes, and the materials of the foundation that bears her name. It is, in the visual language of how we remember the people we have lost, the image that stands for her, that insists, in the way that photographs of the living insist, on the reality and the fullness and the irreducible humanity of the person they depict. She was real. She was here. She smiled exactly like that. The photograph is also, for anyone who looks at it knowing what happened to her, a kind of unbearable thing. Not because there is anything dark in it. There is not. It is a beautiful, ordinary, warm photograph of a young woman who is happy in the moment it captures. It is unbearable because of what comes after it, because of the gap between the life that image represents and the life that was actually lived, because of the distance between the future that was visible in that smile and the future that actually arrived. She should be older now. The person in that photograph should be somewhere in her 30s. In the thick of the career she had been preparing for, doing the work that mattered, surrounded by the people who loved her. She should be calling her parents on weekends. She should be sending her brother photographs of wherever she is living. She should be, in the particular way of young scientists who have found their footing, contributing to the body of human knowledge about the atmosphere that she had devoted years of her life to understanding. She is not. She is 26 years old in that photograph, and she is 26 years old in the record, and she will be 26 years old in the memory of everyone who carries her, and the world is smaller for her absence. The broader conversation about violence against women that the Yinjing Zhang case contributed to is one that was already ongoing when she died, and that continues today with undiminished urgency. Violence against women, including the particular category of predatory violence that the Christensen case represents, Violence that is planned and targeted and rooted in a desire for domination and control is not a rare or isolated phenomenon. It is a pattern. It is a pattern that researchers have documented extensively, that advocates have worked to address for decades, that the legal system has slowly and imperfectly developed tools to respond to. And it is a pattern that persists, that continues to claim lives, that continues to produce cases that share features with the Yingying Zhang case in ways that are too consistent to be coincidental. The role of violent misogynistic online communities in that pattern is one of the most actively discussed and debated aspects of contemporary gender-based violence prevention. These communities, the forums and platforms and networks where men who harbor violent desires toward women find each other and find validation, are not peripheral to the problem of male violence against women. They are, the evidence increasingly suggests, central to the radicalization pathway that leads some men from private violent ideation to public violent action. The Christensen case is one of the clearest documented examples of that pathway. The Darknet forum where he posted, the escalation in the specificity and the planning detail of his posts over time, the eventual translation of what had been written fantasy into physical action on the afternoon of July 1, 2017. This is a pattern that recurs in other cases with other perpetrators. In other cities and countries and contexts, the names change, the specifics change. The pattern persists. Understanding that pattern is necessary for preventing it. And preventing it requires a range of interventions, technological, legal, educational, clinical, that are being developed and with varying degrees of effectiveness and at varying scales. The work is incomplete. The results are uneven. The problem persists. But the conversation is happening. The research is ongoing. And cases like the Yingying Zhang case, documented in detail, prosecuted fully, embedded in the public record in a way that makes them available to researchers and educators and policymakers, contribute to that conversation in ways that matter. In the years since the trial, Zheng Shu has continued to speak about Yingying Zhang. He has spoken about who she was, about the specific texture of knowing her, of loving her, of building a life alongside her in the particular circumstances of graduate school in a foreign country. He has spoken about the things that he misses, not the abstract qualities but the specific ones, the way she laughed, the way she engaged with ideas she found interesting, the way she moved through the world with a kind of open and generous attentiveness that made the people around her feel noticed and valued. He has spoken about what it has been like to live in the aftermath of her death, about the particular quality of grief that attaches to a violent and sudden loss, the grief that is complicated by the knowledge of how the person died, by the images that knowledge produces, by the inability to think about the person you loved without those images intruding, about the way that grief changes over time, not lessening exactly but changing shape, becoming something that is more integrated into the fabric of life, rather than something that is constantly rupturing it. He has also spoken about moving forward, about the life he has continued to build in the years after Yingying's death, about the ways in which carrying her memory is something he does not experience as a burden but as a responsibility, a commitment to ensuring that she is not reduced to her victimhood, that the person she was continues to exist in the world in the form of the people who knew her, and who refused to let the story of her murder be the only story is told about her. He speaks her name. Her family speaks her name. The foundation that bears her name speaks it, and in the speaking, in the insistence on the fullness of who she was, in the refusal to let her be only a case number or a victim label or a piece of evidence in a federal proceeding, in all of that, some cases, never truly close, not in the legal sense, not in the human sense, not in the sense that the people who carry them are ever fully able to set them down and walk away. The verdict was delivered. The sentence was handed down. The man who took Yingying Zhang from the world sits on federal death row in Terre Haute, Indiana, waiting for a resolution that the appeals process has not yet delivered. The legal machinery continues to turn slowly and methodically, in the way that federal capital cases turn, without urgency, without drama, without the kind of visible momentum that the outside world can easily track. Brent Christensen remains alive. Yinjing Zhang does not. That asymmetry is something her family lives with every day. Her father Rongao Zhang, her mother Lifeng Ye, her brother, they wake up each morning in a world that her absence has permanently reshaped. They carry her in the way that the people who loved someone carry them after they are gone, not as a weight exactly, but as a presence. As something that occupies a space that nothing else can fill. The Yingying Zhang Foundation continues its work. It continues to advocate for international students, to build the kind of community infrastructure that makes campuses safer and more supportive, to ensure that the institutions which recruit young people from across the world take seriously their responsibility to protect them. It is quiet work, important work, work that she would have recognized and respected because it is directed, as she was directed, toward something real. She was a scientist. She believed in evidence, in careful observation, in the patient accumulation of understanding. She believed that the world could be known more fully if you were willing to with enough care, and enough rigor and enough time. She was right about that. She was right about most things. She was 26 years old when she stepped into a stranger's car on a warm afternoon in Champaign, Illinois. She was 26 years old when the world lost her. She is 26 years old in every photograph, in every memory, in the hearts of everyone who carries her name forward into a future she never got to see. Her name is Yingying Zhang. She came from Nanping, Fujian Province, China. She crossed an ocean for a dream that was worth crossing oceans for. She was loved completely and she loved completely in return. She deserved every year that was taken from her. Remember her name. Not as a victim, as a person. As a daughter and a scientist and a photographer and a friend who laughed and worked and walked through the wide Illinois landscape with open eyes and an open heart. Yinjing Zhang. Say her name. Thank you for listening tonight. If this story moved you, please leave a comment, like, and subscribe. Good night, and stay safe.